There is some big news this week for financial institutions, which is that a new version of the BSA AML manual came out. And that's the manual that governs how financial institutions and non-financial institutions are supposed to comply with the Bank Secrecy Act in the United States when they create their compliance program. And probably a lot of you are thinking right now, well, that's not great news. In this environment, we certainly weren't looking to increase our spend on compliance, and we don't want to increase the risk of exposure to potential fines. But in fact, there's some good news. So I'm here to tell you that there are aspects of this new version of the BSA AML manual, which is an update as part of a set of rolling updates, that you can use to potentially reduce your exposure to fines. And this all has to do with the legal status of the BSA AML manual. In the past, a lot of regulators and really a lot of banks have treated the BSA manual as if it's a law. And that's wrong. It is not a law. It's not even a regulation, much less a statute. And it doesn't have the force of law. And regulators, both in conversations with banks and even in legal filings, have sometimes suggested that it has the force of law, and that's incorrect. And that's finally clarified in this new version of the BSA AML manual. So last year, I co-authored a couple of articles in the Banking Law Journal that discussed this exact thing, that the BSA AML manual should not be treated as if it has the force of law. And maybe the regulators read those articles because they just clarified that there's a number of provisions within the BSA AML manual that should not be treated as if they have the force of law. One big example of this is risk assessments. There is an entire cottage industry out there around risk assessments, how they should be done, what the requirements are for a risk assessment, and everyone assumes that they're legally required. Well, the new version of the BSA AML manual clarifies they're not. There is no law requiring a bank to have a risk assessment. Similarly, the BSA AML manual contains a long discussion of independent testing and various requirements that they suggest that banks adopt when they're doing independent testing. And the new manual clarifies that many of those independent testing requirements are in fact not legally required. They're just recommendations. So you might be thinking, well, that's great, I can just throw the manual out, but you should not do that. When you're thinking about what does this new information mean for me, don't ignore the BSA AML manual. It is still going to be the Bible for those examiners that you meet with whenever you're in the middle of an examination, and they still have an incredible amount of power over you as a financial institution. So you don't want to ignore it because of that reason. You also don't want to ignore it because there's a lot of great ideas in the BSA AML manual. And one of the best ideas out there is a risk assessment. Even though it's not legally required, it is a great idea, and you're a lot more likely to be able to comply with the Bank Secrecy Act if you do comply with the BSA AML manual suggestions, even those that are not legally binding. So what does this mean to you? How can you use this information? And I think it's most important when you as a financial institution are being threatened. So if an examiner comes to you and says, we're thinking of downgrading your institution, or they say, we're thinking of imposing a fine on you, this gives you something that you can use to push back. If an examiner waves the BSA AML manual in your face and says, you violated this manual, you violated the law, you need to keep in mind that a lot of what's in that manual isn't legally required. And they can't write you up for a violation of law because you adopted a BSA AML program that is different than the recommendations that are in the BSA AML manual. So this can be tricky because there's portions of the BSA AML manual that discuss the law, there's portions that discuss regulations or guidance, and then there are portions that are just recommendation. But I've got good news for you. I'm a lawyer. So if you have any questions about what is legally required and what's not legally required, give me a call. I would love to discuss it with you.